Welcome. Today we'll be reviewing DBD's 4th DLC chapter, known as Spark of Madness. This chapter was released in May of 2017, and included the standard affair of one survivor, killer, and map. The killer of this chapter is the Doctor, a crazed man attempting to understand the inner workings of the human mind. The survivor for this chapter is Feng Min, an esports gamer with a fierce competitive spirit. The chapter's new featured map is the Treatment Theater, taking place in a brand new realm called Lery's Memorial Institute. This video will cover all these topics, but I first want to look at our insidious doctor, known as Herman Carter. The Doctor is certainly an interesting case when it comes to lore. He's definitely one of the game's older killers, which means he falls into that trap of not really providing enough information in his lore bio, with the use of vague language and an ending with many loose ends. Herman Carter understood the human mind quite well, and his story, at least at the start, paints him as a generally good guy. He seemed to only have an interest in the human psyche, but was herded into Lery's Memorial Institute, a place that is basically a secret CIA operation in his story. The Doctor's job was to use the power of psychology to extract information from spies that the CIA placed before him. The Doctor's interrogations started off relatively normal, but ramped up in their severity quickly, with one of his preferred methods being electroshock therapy. Things got worse and worse before the entire operation was shut down and covered up by the CIA, with Herman Carter being nowhere to be found. The Doctor's original story has a lot of potential. I really like the ideas it presents, such as referencing real-life events like Project MKUltra, a really frightening CIA program. The idea of the Doctor wanting to achieve mind control and using shocks to do so is also a great setup, and a pretty neat way to relate to his in-game presence. Thankfully, we now have the archives, a way for characters' lore to be drip-fed in small paragraphs and cutscenes. The Doctor's was one of the earlier stories, and it essentially rewrote him from the ground up. Carter's original story seemed to imply that he was good at one point in time, but got a little too involved with the CIA project and basically lost his humanity in the process. His archive story pretty much says, screw that, and presents a different idea. The Doctor was always a terrible person. In his archives, Herman is shown to be cruel, manipulative, and egotistical. He almost has a god complex, if I'm being honest. He still has an interest in the human brain, but his goal in this new story was always to control it. He even technically experiments on his own parents, using subliminal frequencies to make them fight. The Doctor still uses shocks in this story, but blatant torture is also a part of his repertoire. It's pretty frightening just how unhinged he is, and the final cutscene is gruesome to the point that I like to pretend I never watched it. Overall, I would say that the Doctor's rewrite was really successful. His original story had some confusing points with an ending that didn't make much sense, but I'm a huge fan of this new interpretation. I just love that he went from being a relatively harmless man that got caught up in something way beyond his control, to a person that is blatantly evil with effectively no redeeming qualities. The Doctor might be one of the most evil killers in the game. Before looking at the Doctor's power, I'm going to do a very quick overview of his stats. He's about as standard as it gets, having a 32-meter terror radius and moving at 115% speed. Now for his power, Carter's Spark. One of the main parts of the Doctor's power is shock therapy, an attack that unleashes a shock at a range of 10 meters by default. This shot can hit multiple survivors, and any survivors it hits will be unable to do most actions for 2.5 seconds. The main way this is applicable is in a chase. It can prevent survivors from dropping pallets or vaulting windows. The Doctor has another main ability, this one being Static Blast. After a short charge up, any survivors in the Doctor's terror radius will scream, revealing their position. Static Blast has a 60-second cooldown afterwards. Both Shock Therapy and Static Blast have some nice effects, but another major part of the Doctor's power is Madness. Madness is an effect that is applied when survivors are hit by both of Doctor's main abilities. Madness has 3 different tiers, with each tier being a little more severe than the last. Hitting a survivor with Shock Therapy fills half a Madness tier, while hitting them with Static Blast fills one full Madness tier. One thing to note is survivors will always scream each time their Madness tier is increased. Let's next look at what each tier actually does. Madness 1 is pretty basic, it only gives a 33% chance of every skill check being a Madness skill check. Madness skill checks are a unique type of skill check that are intended to be a little bit harder than normal, sometimes being in reverse or on different parts of the screen than the middle. They're basically designed to mess with your muscle memory. Madness 2 increases the chance of Madness skill checks to 66%, but also has a unique effect that causes survivors to see hallucinations of the Doctor. It's a nice aesthetic detail that can potentially be useful for gameplay as well. If the Doctor has certain add-ons, he can actually see the illusions on the map, allowing him to track survivors using them. Madness 3 causes survivors to continuously scream, revealing their location pretty frequently. They are also unable to do many actions until they snap out of it. This is a unique action that forces the survivors to stop in place and complete a series of skill checks to snap out of their madness. Doing so will reset them to Madness 1. So yeah, there's definitely a lot to the Doctor's power, but I'd like to next talk about my actual thoughts on it. I've always been somewhat divided on Doctor's power, if I'm being honest. There's aspects of it I definitely like, but others that still seem strange to me. Overall though, I definitely like it more than I hate it. One thing I've never really thought is healthy about Doctor is the fact that he is absolutely a noob stomper. You could argue that many killers have powers that destroy newer players, but Doctor takes it to a whole different level. This mainly comes in the form of his madness. New players definitely struggle to hit madness skill checks, while some people struggle to even snap out of it in Madness 3. Like seriously, sometimes I almost feel bad when I can tell I'm facing an inexperienced player. This poor Elodie was stuck in Madness 3 for so long in the corner of the map that she actually got AFK crows. Another aspect of him that can be confusing are his add-ons. A lot of them have really long effect text, and some even have effects specifically designed to deceive you. As an example, some of Doctor's add-ons cause the survivor to see a fake red stain, and hear a really loud heartbeat in higher tiers of madness, almost as though the Doctor were right on top of you. Other add-ons play a fake terror radius, making you think the Doctor is close by when in reality he very well could be across the map. These gameplay elements are the types of things that make almost no sense to somebody new to the game, and even a lot of experienced players don't fully understand what all of Doctor's add-ons do. From a game design perspective, this makes the Doctor a little flawed, but otherwise, I actually am pretty alright with the rest of his power. Static Blast is, in my opinion, really well designed. It has a punishing cooldown if you misuse it, but rewards players that use intuition to time it correctly. The only thing that I would say is a bit cheesy about the ability is that it relies on the Doctor's terror radius, so you can use certain builds that make your Static Blast huge, removing a lot of the skill aspect of it. Regardless, Static Blast is great. It's basically an activatable Infectious Fright, and Infectious is a really good perk. You know, talking about Static Blast has definitely reminded me of a certain older Doctor. I kind of have to talk about it at some point, so I think this is a pretty good time to do so. Doctor was one of the earlier killers to ever receive a pretty substantial rework. This included changing up his power quite a bit, reworking his add-ons, and giving him a unique terror radius and chase theme. If I could use one word to describe old Doctor, it would be clunky. Alongside clunky, he was also arguably even more confusing than he is now. Madness essentially worked the same. It was split into 3 tiers, but the snap out of it interaction was even harder than it is now. Missing even a single skill check would fully revert the progress bar, so newer players got absolutely destroyed by Madness 3 with old Doctor. Oh, and some other really weird parts about snap out of it is that it was treated as a healing action, so a Doctor using Nurse's Calling could actually see you snapping out of it. It also worked with Calrophobia, which on smaller maps was horrifying. Can you imagine being stuck in the snap out of it action for over 20 seconds? Probably the main part that was distinct about old Doctor was the fact that he was split into 2 modes, treatment mode and punishment mode. Punishment mode basically has one function, it's the way the Doctor attacks. It doesn't do anything other than allow the Doctor to swing his weapon and move at normal speed. The weirdness of it comes from treatment mode. Treatment mode caused survivors to passively gain madness if they were in the Doctor's terror radius. This had a lot of ramifications. At the start of a match, a Doctor could, if I'm being honest, pretty brainlessly walk around in treatment mode and immediately have all survivors in the map reveal themselves instantly. There wasn't any timing like Static Blast, and there wasn't any cooldown either. You'd think that I'm calling old Doctor really strong, but it's quite the opposite. Old Doctor was incredibly annoying, but at the same time he just wasn't good at all. Treatment mode caused him to walk slower, which was frustrating to play as, and the worst part was how awkward his chasing was. Treatment mode used to be the only way the Doctor could use shock therapy. In a chase, the Doctor would have to switch to treatment mode to go for a shock, which slowed him down by the way, and then switch back to punishment mode to attempt to hit them after a shock. This wasn't an easy swap either, it took a fair amount of time to switch between modes. Did you know that at one point Doctor's shock therapy didn't even prevent survivors from vaulting windows or dropping pallets? I actually can't even figure out what his original design was supposed to be. What was his niche? Was it tracking? I'll admit he was really good at finding survivors, but beyond that, he really didn't have much. It's kind of hilariously sad. If you look at Doctor's change list, you'll see he got so many buffs in his original form, but by the end, he was still quite bad. His main gimmicks were finding survivors and controlling 3-gen setups. Beyond that, he was generally clunky and unimpressive in a chase. And that brings me back to the current Rework Doctor. This is probably one of the more successful reworks a killer has ever gotten. I already gushed about Static Blast earlier, but I absolutely love the direction they took for that ability. It takes much more timing and thought than treatment mode ever did, plus I'd argue it's way stronger too. Getting rid of the split modes was also absolutely incredible. It's genuinely shocking, I had to do it once, how much cleaner it made him feel in a chase. No more switching between modes, you can shock and be almost immediately ready to attack afterwards. Another great thing Doctor's Rework did was standardizing how Madness worked. It increased and decreased at confusing rates before, but as I explained earlier, current Doctor is really simple. One shock therapy is half a Madness tier, while Static Blast increases one full tier of Madness. It's simple and easy to understand for both sides, allowing both the Doctor and the survivors to fully understand what is needed to increase their Madness. So, what did the rework do for his power level? I'd say current Doctor landed himself in a really average position. He's certainly not bad, but also not extremely amazing either. It seems to be a fairly common opinion by most people that he's about the definition of average. It's still absolutely a huge improvement from where he was before. Doctor before his rework essentially relied on gimmicks, and even with those gimmicks, he wasn't anything amazing. So how does the Doctor feel in a match? Before this video, I really didn't play much Doctor at all, but I was pleasantly surprised with a lot of aspects of his kit when I started playing him. One thing that I've always found annoying in DBD are those situations where you literally can't find someone, often because the survivors are playing quite immersed, as many people say. Doctor has quite the answer for that in Static Blast. It's so nice just having a button that helps me find people, and it feels rewarding to correctly time it and find someone as a result. I had mentioned earlier that the Doctor himself as a character seems to have a god complex, and his gameplay sort of feels that way too. Strength-wise, no, you don't entirely feel like a god, but actions such as Static Blast just make you feel powerful. Shock Therapy has a similar feeling. It has a nice amount of bass to the sound effect, and gives you that similar feeling of power.
I see you, Zap.
Sometimes I honestly feel sort of bad after shocking someone and watching them desperately trying to do something. Anything. Like, do you not know how Doctor works, or are you just that desperate? Even though I'm supposed to be the killer, I do have a heart. Another thing that I find so fascinating about Doctor is the ways with which you can invade survivors' minds. I really doubt it's intentional, but you sort of get that vibe of actually taking on the persona of the Doctor. He was all about attempting to understand what makes humans tick, and that translates so well into his gameplay. This is where the Doctor really shines in my opinion. You approach situations in a much different way than other killers. Take this situation for example. I bait out a head-on from this Yun Jin, who I assumed had head-on due to a previous encounter. I timed a shock right before she vaulted the shack window, completely halting what could have been a nice vault. Thankfully, Iron Maiden gave me a one-shot down since she had recently hid in the locker. I knew a Claudette was lurking nearby, so I began to chase her. Instead of committing to the shock, I only made the noise as a means to scare her. She vaulted shack window, which might have looked silly, but I believe it was actually the correct play. Doctor's shock takes a bit to take effect, so Claudette made the right play in committing to the window. She absolutely could have queued up the vault in time, which is what I predicted she would think. Thankfully, the noise of the shock alone scared her into vaulting, where I met her on the other side. This was another moment that absolutely fascinates me. I had a previous interaction with this Serena, in which she correctly guessed my movement, resulting in her winning this little mind game. I took that into account and, later on, changed up my movement just a little bit to force her to drop a pallet in a different way than before. I guessed correctly and got a hit as a result. This right here is what I love about Doctor. He isn't my absolute favorite by any means out of DBD's many killers, but this is the aspect of him that I like the best. I figure that's a good time to transition into playing against the Doctor. A lot of people are annoyed by him, and in some ways, I do understand. He was pretty much designed to be anti-stealth, and for new players, his shock attack feels simply oppressive in a chase. In fact, I'd argue just about every aspect of Doctor is oppressive to newer players. He really is amazing at stomping noobs, something his rework did little to fix. That's not to say he's useless against good players though. Timing is everything with the Doctor, both in his Static Blast and shock therapy. Regardless, I definitely get why new players don't like him, and even in some ways understand why experienced players feel the same. I get why people feel robbed when they can't do the basic actions that take place in a chase, such as vaulting or dropping pallets. I think for me personally, I just get so interested in the mind game potential for playing around as Shock. It makes pretty much every match against Doctor feel unique, especially since many people play Doctor in different ways. Now, I will say that some doctors just sort of spam Shocks endlessly, and while this isn't particularly effective, it can be a bit frustrating. It's not a good way to play since it usually takes forever for the doctor to actually catch up to you, but it can definitely be annoying. It's basically like bloodlusting. One thing I'll agree is universally pretty annoying about Doctor is snapping out of it. It isn't hard or anything, but it's basically like mending with Legion, where you just hold a button for a bit. It makes sense for Doctor to have a mechanic that gives him a benefit for putting survivors in Madness 3. Plus, having built-in slowdown is pretty nice. At least Snap Out of It has skill checks to keep you a little bit engaged. Next up, I want to talk about the visual details of the Doctor since I haven't really gotten a chance to yet. He's old for sure, but Behavior's art team pretty much always delivers, and Doctor is no different. The permanent, pried-open mouth and eyes make him a genuinely disturbing sight. Plus, the electroconvulsive gear around his head really sells that Mad Doctor vibe. One nice thing is that Doctor recently received a fairly large graphic overhaul to bring him up to the more modern graphics of the current game. I much prefer his new look to the old one. The old version certainly wasn't bad or anything, but it almost looked a little too comical. Doctor's new look keeps the essence of who he is, but the added details make him a much better fit for a horror-themed game. One thing that's been a constant of Doctor is his maniacal laughter. You can't have a Mad Doctor character without an evil laugh, right? Doctor's is so great. It sounds like he's always having a genuinely good time doing the thing he loves. Behavior even made sure that his laugh sounds forced, I guess is the best way to describe it. You can absolutely tell that the laugh is coming from someone with a pried open mouth. Doctor's Mori is alright. It's certainly not bad or anything, but it feels a little dated in my opinion. It's a little too simple, I guess. I feel like the Doctor would make a great spectacle out of one of his killings. It's not bad at all, just a little dated. For the Doctor's chase theme, well, I actually really like it. Doctor was one of the first killers to receive a unique theme after Behavior started giving them to older characters, and I think his music is a perfect thematic fit. The opening faraway music is so eerie, it's honestly perfect. What many people in the community aren't as big a fan of is his actual in-chase music. It's an explosive cacophony of percussion and just general nonsense noise. There's no other way to describe it. It isn't music in the traditional sense. Isn't this kind of perfect though? The Doctor is the type of guy that would literally torture you given the opportunity. You can't really tell what the track is even supposed to be, not to mention his general theming of madness. I don't see how this isn't a fitting theme. It isn't exactly pleasant to listen to, but that's kind of the whole point. If the Doctor had a soothing, easy to listen to track, how would that do his character any justice at all? Behavior took a bold leap with this track, and in my opinion, it paid off. The Spark of Madness chapter introduced a new survivor to the game, this time around being Feng Min. She's mostly known in the story as being fiercely competitive and focused. Really focused. Anyway, another important part about Feng's character is that before being taken by the entity, she was a pro esports gamer. I feel like Feng is sort of a time capsule of that era where a bunch of games had gamer characters, possibly in an attempt to be ironic or funny? I'm not too sure. Regardless, Feng is probably one of the least egregious of this character type. DBD characters, or at least the survivors, usually can't talk, so thankfully we don't have to endure any generic gamer phrases. You know what I'm talking about.
AFK.
Other than her default look and a couple other outfits, most of her cosmetics don't immediately scream gamer, which I think is a good thing. That's usually the failure of this character type in my eyes. They pretty much only focus on that singular character trait of being a gamer and leave little ounce in the means of character development. As a whole, Feng is pretty harmless. She's a byproduct of an era that is honestly probably still going, but manages to execute her stereotype better than most, possibly in part due to DBD's limited storytelling. As expected, each character introduced in this chapter has 3 new perks to offer for their respective roles. I'll start with the doctors, first of which is Overwhelming Presence. It's got an extremely simple effect. It increases the consumption rate of items by 100% when survivors are using those items in your terror radius. Alongside having some very strange flavor text, it's very unimpressive. It being based on terror radius means it's pretty useless on some killers, and even on the killers it could be decent with, the effect is still very mediocre. Items are a lot less relevant than they used to be, and other than medkits, some charge-based add-ons don't last super long anyway, so Overwhelming Presence doesn't do too much. Oh, and it used to be worse, having only a 50% penalty instead of 100%. I really wouldn't recommend using this one ever. It has almost no redeeming qualities.
Oh, you might with. Oh my god! Holy crap, Shane.
Next up is Monitor and Abuse. It increases your terror radius by 8 meters while you're in a chase, but decreases your terror radius by 8 meters when you aren't in a chase, while also increasing your FOV slightly. I still really wish that the base FOV of killers was buffed, and perks like this were changed, but admittedly the FOV isn't really the reason you use it. Monitor is actually super amazing, mainly for the decreased terror radius. It's pretty much the go-to with killers that already have somewhat small terror radiuses. It's incredibly good on Hag, Deathslinger, and Trickster. It can even be alright on other killers. It definitely does a nice job of masking your approach just a tiny bit. The increased terror radius in chase can be kind of neat for weird gimmick builds, and can also just generally throw off some inexperienced players that don't understand what the perk does. Otherwise, this part of the effect doesn't matter too much. Regardless, Monitor is a super nice perk. It's quite useful on many killers and has an applicable effect that you'll almost always get some value out of. Doctor's last perk is Overcharge. Kicking a gen will cause it to become overcharged, which creates a difficult skill check for the next survivor that interacts with that gen. If they fail the skill check, there is an additional regression penalty. This one is honestly just a remnant of Old Doctor. Like Old Doctor, it's really good against newer players, but does next to nothing against anybody that has played the game for a little bit. Overcharge sounds nice in theory. It has no cooldown and lasts indefinitely until a survivor touches that gen. The problem is that the difficult skill check isn't really, difficult. This means that you'll very rarely actually get the effect of Overcharge to go off, so it isn't even really useful as a tracking tool or game slowdown. Ironically enough, the only way it can even be a little useful is on the Doctor himself, since Madness skill checks combined with Overcharge can actually be kind of difficult for even an experienced player to hit. Keep in mind I did say kind of, it's still possible that it'll do nothing. I really can't recommend this one unfortunately, it's just hopelessly dated. Next up are Feng's perks, starting with Technician. This one was absolutely designed with beginners in mind. Failing a generator skill check with this perk prevents the gen from being blown up, so the killer won't hear the loud noise or see a notification. The downside to this is that the gen receives some additional regression as a penalty. It also decreases the range that the killer can hear generator repairs by 8 meters. Technician is pretty bad. The fact that it even has a downside is kind of hilarious, since the advantages it has are pretty pathetic. Another hilarious aspect of the perk is that it used to be luck reliant, only having a 50% chance of stopping a generator from blowing up on missed skill checks. It's been buffed now, but it's still really unimpressive. The most useful part is probably the decreased sound range on repairs, but even that effect is really situational at best. Can't say I would ever really recommend this one, unless you're brand new to the game. Feng's next perk is Lithe. It's an exhaustion perk, allowing you to move at 150% speed for 3 seconds after vaulting a window, but with the standard 40-second exhaustion status effect afterwards. I love Lithe. It's probably one of the most wholesome perks in the game. I can't help but smile when I see someone using Lithe as killer, like, you go man, keep doing your thing. It's probably one of the most balanced perks in the whole game, with a really nice effect that's good, but isn't too strong. Fun fact, it used to only work when you were actively in a chase, so there were some really unfortunate times where Lithe just wouldn't activate because the game technically thought you weren't in a chase. I'm super glad they changed that aspect of the perk. It made it really frustrating to use. Overall, I love Lithe. Feng's last perk is Alert. It shows you the killer's aura for 5 seconds every time they perform a breaking action, such as kicking a pallet or generator. A simple effect, but surprisingly useful. I feel like people underrate this one quite a bit. It's a really nice information tool for solo players, but telling you where the killer is and what pallets they are breaking can be amazing to know. With some map knowledge, you'll pretty much immediately know which pallets have been broken, which can help you later down the line in a chase. Alert used to be much worse as well. It had a range restriction and a cooldown for some reason, but the current version is really nice. I'd definitely recommend it for both new and experienced players. As expected, the Doctor's chapter launched with a new map and realm, this one being the Lery's Memorial Institute. There's only one map for this realm in the treatment theater, and I really doubt that any more maps will be made in the realm. It was also the very first indoor map. Indoor maps are a bit notorious at this point. They tend to be poorly designed and relatively unfun to play on, often for both survivors and killers. I talked a fair bit about this in my pig retrospective, but I think people sort of miss the reason that indoor maps aren't fun to play on. For me, it isn't really the limited sight, although that absolutely is annoying, but it's more so that the tiles on these maps are just plain weird. You don't really have anything like traditional jungle gyms, and all of the palettes on indoor maps are either literal god palettes or ones that are intentionally useless. So how does Lery's stack up against the other indoor maps? Well, if I'm being honest, of the 4 we have right now, Lery's is probably my favorite. None of the game's current indoor maps really feel remotely like I'm playing Dead by Daylight, but I would say that Lery's feels the closest. It doesn't have a weird layout. I mean, the map is literally shaped like a rectangle. It has a fair amount of palettes, some of which are pretty good and others that aren't. It's not like other indoor maps where there's an extremely small amount of windows. In fact, Lery's might have more windows than some outdoor maps given the right setup. With all of this being said, Lery's still isn't good. I'd much rather be playing on pretty much any normal map that DBD has to offer, but if I had to choose an indoor map, I'd definitely choose Lery's. It's far from what anybody would consider normal DBD gameplay, but it still manages to be the most fun. Again, not saying much given the quality of most indoor maps, but still. When it comes to visuals, Lery's was actually one of the first to be visually overhauled. Behavior sort of did this before graphic updates were really a thing, or at least before they started officially calling the process the Realm Beyond. Old Lery's wasn't bad visually, but it was definitely a tad bit dated. The new one is pretty nice. It ended up feeling much more horror themed with an overall moodier lighting than the original had. A couple other things I actually do enjoy about Lery's are its 2 main landmarks. The main room has always wowed me. It's a pretty visually impressive room with a ton of literal moving parts. It's such a great room to demonstrate the messed up experiments of the Doctor. The other main landmark of the map is this room here, the library, which is still such an enigma to me. The fact that Behavior was able to essentially transfer the Killer Shack into an indoor map is a pretty impressive feat. It's certainly not the same as the Killer Shack, and the layout is notably different, but it still has a god palette with a relatively strong window that creates good 50-50 mind games. Despite my praise on some aspects of Lery's, I'm still overall not a fan of the map. It tried to be unique, and was the first of its kind to do so, but it's just not the DBD I know and love. It's certainly the best of the indoor maps in my eyes, but that will probably never be a particularly large praise. The Spark of Madness chapter will always intrigue me. It didn't have a good start, but thankfully over time, the Doctor was changed to be a pretty interesting and dynamic killer. He's landed himself in a pretty solid position where he certainly isn't bad, but isn't the absolute best thing either. The only unfortunate remnant of his older form is that he destroys newer players, an unlucky side effect of his power that will probably never be truly fixed. Feng Min was a unique survivor that took a stereotype, but wasn't extremely in your face about it. For perks, not all of them were winners, but I'd say that both survivors and killers got some new fun options, even if some of the perks were pretty forgettable. Lery's Memorial Institute isn't a very good map, but it's my personal favorite of the current indoor maps in the game. It at least tried to do some unique things, and I have to say that some of the map's landmarks are actually kind of good. Overall, I would say Doctor's chapter was a success. It left a pretty lasting impact on the game with a unique survivor, some fun perks, and a killer that received one of the most successful reworks of the game's history.